So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for coming and taking the time. I'll hand over to our moderator for the day, Jean Milligan, IOE Director of Communications, and let's start.
Thank you, Robert. So good morning, good afternoon, and evening, everyone. I hope you're all well and healthy, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Welcome to this IOE Digital Conference on Climate Action in a Post-COVID-19 Landscape. We look forward to an interesting session with our great speakers, and we're looking forward to also plenty of questions from our participants in the chat section. So I'm Jean Milligan, Director of Communications at the International Organization of Employers, IOE, and I have the pleasure of moderating this exchange today. So I'd first like to ask all participants to mute your microphones, except of course the speakers. And you have the chat function, which is available for any questions and comments, so please feel free to use it. We're going to track all of those comments and questions and bring them up in the Q&A session. So I thought today what we do, we're going to start and we're going to try to answer some of these questions today. And some of these questions are, how can lessons learned from COVID-19 be integrated into economic resilience initiatives to climate-related events? And in what ways are international agencies taking a fresh look at their climate efforts in light of the COVID-19 economic response and recovery? And so we have a group of distinguished panelists with us. Rodolfo Lacey, Director, the Environmental Directorate at the OECD. Nigel Topping, Nigel, welcome. High-level climate action champion, part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We have Jenny Bofinger-Schuster, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Senior Vice President, Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility, Siemens. And Vic Van Buren, Director of the Enterprise Department at the International Labour Organization. And Nancy Ibarro Palacios, Director of Sustainable Production and Consumption, Department of Sustainable Development at the Colombian Employers Organization. Welcome all of you. Thank you for being with us today. So we're going to split this session into two parts. The first part, Mr. Lacey and Mr. Topping, we're going to speak to us, and then we'll take a round of questions. Followed that, Ms. Bofinger-Schuster, Mr. Van Buren, and Ms. Ibarro Palacio will speak to us in the second part, followed again by another round of Q&A. So each of you speakers will have 7 minutes, and forgive me ahead of time, I'm going to interrupt you at 6 minutes and 30 seconds to give you a heads up about how much time you have to wrap up. So before we start, I'd like to give the floor to the IOE Secretary General, Roberto Suarez Santos, to sort of welcome us and set the scene. Roberto, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you to all. First of all, dear participants, thank you for the reputed speakers that have joined us. Well, it's a pleasure for me as Secretary General of the IOE to welcome you in this virtual dialogue on climate action, also from the perspective of employment, from the perspective of the skills, which is also the perspective that we have been developing throughout the years. Well, perhaps I don't have to present IOE. IOE represents more than 50 billion companies through independent and representative member organizations in 147 countries. This is not the important element. The important added value is that these companies and these employers' organizations are the major contributors in shaping policies. They are the ones having a say when policies are set at national level. Governments consult them before setting up a new regulation. And that's critical in this debate. We have been for 100 years, and this year is the centenary of IOE. Perhaps you could say, well, it's not the best year to celebrate a centenary, but it's also a critical opportunity for us. We have been committed to values, to social values, how companies, how enterprises have an impact in society. We did it in the ILO, but now more broadly. Of course, we are very aware of the unprecedented crisis, and we use the world crisis, because it's going to be a crisis, economic and social crisis, that the world is going through. The incredible economic and societal impacts that has brought to people, to individuals, to employees, to business. We are talking now about 94% of the world's workers living in countries with some type of workplace closure measures in place, but also millions of jobs being lost, and also millions of companies that are closing or under threat. But on the other hand, climate change is still happening. It's accelerating and should not be ignored, and we are very much aware of that. The effects of climate change have a slower onset, perhaps due to the pandemic, but are systemic, global, and we should not forget that, and already causing significant damage to people, livelihoods, and businesses. According to UNFCCC, and thank you also for joining us, a representative from the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change, there are overall 1.47 billion jobs which depend on a stable climate. There are also new jobs opportunities coming, but we don't have to underestimate also the risk that we have. We as employers believe this is a critical moment. On one hand, governments are dealing with the virus and the pandemics, trying to absorb the shocks, and they are putting into place stimulus packages. We are talking about 9 trillion of fiscal stimulus plans. We have been saying that with the trade unions, but also with other stakeholders, this investment should go to where it's needed. But there is a huge opportunity to make of the pandemic crisis an opportunity not just to get out on a sustainable mood for employment creation, but also for climate change anticipation. If we know how to shape infrastructure and industries for the decades to come. We are seeing, it's true, some positive effects on nature of the pandemic, but those are temporary effects which have to do with global emissions. What matters is attitudes from individuals and attitudes from companies and policymakers. And that's where we have to act. What is important are the lessons that we can learn and how can we leverage the opportunities that we have in front of us. We are talking about resilient recovery, which has to do with climate change anticipations. Existing technologies and rapid implementation can create an enable environment for business to operate and anticipate to the goals of the Paris Agreement. I have to say that business have been hit hard, it's true, but it's very often the case, and we have seen that many of them have adapted incredibly and show resilience, innovation, and show the capacity to work for society and be at the core of the business values with a sustainability approach. Of course, we need help, we need support, and that's why we are talking about efficient partnerships. If we want to succeed, the way forward is partnership and efficiently working in partnership. Still, we are far away from having this efficiency in partnerships. And we should not forget that at the end of the day, we will never be able to achieve the objectives if the business community and those entrepreneurships are not stimulated. And in order to do that, we need a proper business environment, which is not either the case in many countries. So we have a historic opportunity to implement important change across the board. We have to integrate all the lessons, and the idea of this exchange is precisely how we can identify action that can bring together the business community and different international organizations and stakeholders. I don't want to lose much more time. We are looking also to identify follow-up actions. And again, thank you to all the participants. Thank you, Jean. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think, yes, I think taking away from that 9 trillion in financial assistance, and I think we're going to hear a lot the term resilient recovery over the next hour and a half. So I'm going to now, we're going to kick off the dialogue. Mr. Rodolfo Lacey, yes, the OECD. Hello. So the OECD is at the forefront of the economic and environmental policy analysis and advocacy. And I'd like to know how have you been involved in assisting countries in elaborating their COVID-19 recovery policies? And what challenges are they facing to actually introduce also sustainability and resiliency into those recovery policies? So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean. Well, I'm going to share a presentation that I prepared with the highlights of the main policy brief that we are publishing in our hub. We call it like that, but it's a website dedicated only to coronavirus and the economic impacts. We have more than 100 policy briefs that are covering the whole spectrum of the economic sectors that are affected by the COVID crisis. So let me share with you my screen. I'm sure that now you can see the screen. So I have to say that, yes, we lose 300 million jobs in this crisis, and we can create perhaps, or before the crisis, we knew that we can create more than 25 million jobs in the renewables energy, and perhaps in the biodiversity fund, we can create another 25 million. So it is a different order of magnitude, but I'm sure that we can speed up the creation of jobs and wealth in clean industries or sectors if we, of course, apply or implement these policy recommendations that we are doing. So let me go very quickly to the slides. First, you know that there are some specific sectors that were impacted hardly for the crisis. I mean that you know very well that the oil and gas industry, the tourism industry, the aviation, those high emitters sectors were impacted. So we started to see clean airs in our cities, but this is a temporary effect. But how to keep this situation, I mean, how we can reduce greenhouse gases or air pollutants or water pollutants if we have the opportunity to do it in the following months with a new investments that can be reshape, of course, our economies. That's the question that we have, of course. There are some specific sectors with benefits from the crisis, like the agricultural sector, for example, the food processing and retail industry, the e-commerce, and some of these sectors are relying in very polluting activities as shipping, for example, or transportation in trucks. Heavy trucks circulating in some of the cities that were impacted by the crisis were emitting pollutants, and that's why the air quality indexes didn't reduce their levels as we were expecting. But we produce different documents. These are the 3 main documents that are policy brief, as I was explaining. From containment to recovery, environmental health and stretching resilience to pandemics. And the new one that was launched during the Environment Day, the World Environment Day, the 5th of June, is building back better, because that's the paradigm that we are looking at this very moment. We also produce in our Environment Policy Committee a document that analyzed the policy experiences during the last global finance crisis in 2018. So let me tell you also that we are preparing a new set of documents. One is related with a low carbon transition, I'm showing here the bike lane that I use every day. When we moved to this new building of the OECD, we asked the mairie, the municipality, to build this lane, and they answered us that they will delay perhaps 2 or 3 years because they didn't have enough budget, and because of the crisis, and because the people is not willing to take a public transportation, the mayor decided to build in less than 6 months this bike lane. So I'm happy to travel every day from my home to my office in this bike lane, but they created jobs, of course, and many people are more healthy, of course, and we can see these kind of actions in many cities that, of course, are in the right pathway of a more development, sustainable development. We will produce other policy brief, but one that could be very interesting for the organization is the green finance impact, how the COVID-19 crisis is affecting the green finance, the climate finance, the biodiversity finance. But let me start with the first document. I will not read the slides. I just want to show you that one of the main recommendations that we are doing is to avoid unintended negative environmental impacts, because some of our countries are rolling back. I mean, they are having policies, or they are taking policies that instead of promoting more environmental investments or more clean investments, deploying technologies that are low carbon and resilient, they are trying to protect those industries that are high polluters, as I was explaining. We have to put the money where it is feasible to create green jobs. That's the main idea of our policy recommendations. And we also made an analysis of what are the main benefits and co-benefits of doing this. In this document that we named Environmental Health and Stretching the Resilience to Pandemics, we talk about the impacts on air quality, clean water and sanitation, waste and biodiversity loss of the pandemics, how these elements are playing a role in the health crisis that is indeed an environmental crisis. But thinking in how to build back better, I think that we have to put more emphasis in the key dimensions for our resilient economic recovery. So you can see here that we propose that all the stimulus packages and recovery packages, also recovery plans, must emphasize the well-being of the people, and they must be inclusive. And of course, we are trying to align these packages, as in other regions like Europe are doing, to the Paris Agreement goals, for example, or to the CBD targets that we will define in the next year. So let's start.
I'm just going to interrupt you to tell you have your 30-second warning.
Okay, yes, I'm gonna finish with these 4 slides, but you can see that we have a very specific policies. We have to build pipelines of shovel-ready sustainable infrastructure projects. We have, of course, to maintain ambition of long-term environmental objectives. We have to have that long-term vision. We have to improve the resilience of our cities, our sectors, and we have also to design public procurement process to do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Attention.
Thank you.
Let me stop sharing my presentation.
Brilliant. I'm going to we're going to move on to Mr. Nigel Topping. Nigel is he's the high-level climate action champion. So you've had extensive experience, I understand, with multilateral corporate collaboration as you've worked a lot in the private sector as well as with international organizations. So can you tell me, in your opinion, what are the current challenges to multilateral collaboration in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? And also, what is the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic? What kind of opportunities has that brought about to increase action related to climate? And if you have sufficient time, we'd like to hear some of the updates on the plans for COP26. So Nigel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you to the IOE for the opportunity, and thank you, Rodolfo, for the really clear framing from the OECD. It's great. I think it's very aligned from everything that I'm hearing from the businesses that we work with. I mean, Jean, to your first point about obstacles, I mean, I think, you know, the role that I hold now, along with Gonzalo Munoz from Chile, was created in Paris in recognition of the fact that we all know we somehow need to find a better way of national governments and non-state actors, who's my community,
Yeah.
businesses, private businesses, investors, cities, states, and regions working together. So one of the obstacles is that actually this is relatively new for all of us to find ways of recognizing that it's not just the multilateral system alone, if you like, the Westphalian state system, but a new type of collaboration. So we're inventing it at the moment, I think. So that's the first obstacle, is that it hasn't been invented yet. So I think the second obstacle is that sometimes we have a polarized conversation which falls into one of those two naive traps, which either says it's all about policy or it's all about markets, when any really transformational change has to be much more of a complex dance between the two. You know, we often talk about the ambition loop, that you know, if non-state actors, be they businesses or cities, you know, we see some amazing leadership from cities, often ahead of national governments, raise the bar, then that can make it easier for national governments to raise the regulatory floor, and then the positive feedback keeps going on. So I think the other obstacle is that we often get stuck in some cognitive traps, assuming linearity is the main one. So a lot of our thinking about the future assumes that it's a linear progression from the past. We know empirically that industrial transformation always happens exponentially. And so most of the signals that we get from multilateral bodies are already way too late. So, you know, the thing I obsess about a lot, because I spent a lot of my time in the private sector working in the automotive sector, is the phase out of the internal combustion engine. In 2016, just after Paris, the IEA was still saying we're going to be building combustion engines in 2060, 2070, right? Now we have countries saying they're going to phase them out in 2030 for sale, and cities like Paris saying there'll be no combustion engines on the streets in 2030. So we really, the cognitive barrier of linear thinking is perhaps the biggest. It means it tends to make us very unambitious, because we say things like, oh, there's only 3% of EV sales right now, instead of saying, oh my God, it's doubling every 19 months. You know, 3%, when you double it 4 more times, you know, 3, 6, 12, 24, 40, boom, you know, by the end of the decade, it's all over. So I think, and I'd say so if I turn to opportunities, I think the big opportunity from COVID is that I think that is a real sense that we can actually do things much faster than we ever thought. So if you like, that rather cautious linear approach, it's just been blown out of the water. Suddenly we're like, boom, if we want to do something, we can do it very quickly. And I think
hours.
Sorry?
We can do it in hours, apparently.
Well, you know, some things we can do in hours, right? And then if we think about some of these big industrial transformations, we can't do those in hours, because there are huge lots of capital stock and human capital, as well as financial capital or physical capital. But so we know that if we set very clear long-term signals, this goes back to the points that Rodolfo was making about policy, is that communities and private sector respond very well to long-term signals. So when we say we're going to phase out the combustion engine in 2030 or 2032 or 2035, business can kind of get on with that, as long as it's fixed and it doesn't keep wobbling around. You know, that's the sort of time that we need to manage the labor side of just transitions as well, right? You can't just say we're going to stop doing something tomorrow without huge social disruption. So some of these transitions need 10 to 20 years. So I think the big opportunity is in learning from COVID that we can dare to be bolder. I think rather than saying what could we do knowing what we know now, so what do we have to do, and let's commit to doing it. So it's much more of that sort of JFK moonshot mentality. You know, when he committed in 1961 to landing on the moon within 8 years, most specialists thought it was impossible because America didn't have rockets to get humans into orbit, didn't have spacesuits, didn't know what the surface of the moon was like. Some people thought it was 60 feet of dust, and that the moon, the best mathematicians at MIT said we don't know how to calculate the trajectory. So instead of saying, oh, okay, we don't know how to do those, so instead of saying 1969, let's say 2000, which becomes so far away that it doesn't stimulate any activity. He said, no, we're going to do it in 1969. And guess what? We're pretty innovative when we really decide to. So I think having more confidence that we can change things quickly, that we have amazing, and I would say it's engineers and farmers that are going to solve this problem, right? The people who know how to fix things, whether it's in the living world on the farm or in the technical world. I think the final opportunity is the one of all the funding that is going to be allocated. You know, we know that in 2008 we made two big mistakes, that only 1/6 of the stimulus funds tilted the playing field towards a green recovery. Okay, the technology is much further on now, so maybe we can forgive ourselves. Also, most of that recovery went to inflate assets rather than to actually change the direction in the direction that we want. So my sense is we won't make that mistake now. We're talking about how do we accelerate the shift to nature-based solutions, the shift, how do we invest in retrofitting buildings so that we're employing people whilst improving our capital stock? How do we clean the air by speeding up the transition to electric vehicles and clean planes, etc. Last point on COP, I would say that the extra year that we have is an opportunity to build much more momentum towards that vision of a resilient zero carbon economy. You know, Gonzalo and I launched the Race to Zero a few weeks ago. We have thousands of businesses, companies, investors, cities, schools and universities now. I think that's going to go exponential as well. And then we can get more organized around each of these sectoral transitions, whether it's electric vehicles or shipping or food. So that's the main focus for me and Gonzalo, is to keep building momentum and get more organized at that intersection of the multilateral system, which is countries, and markets, which tend to be transversal. So if you like, that matrix. So the aim would be that increasingly we have, as we experimented in the Petersburg dialogues, line ministers, CEOs, mayors, investors, civil society leaders, all coming together around each of these sectoral transformations, so that by the time we get to Glasgow, we're much more confident that we can build a resilient human and economic net zero society in the 2040s, not sometime in the second half of the century.
Not in the 2100s.
No.
Okay, thank you so much. We have some questions that are coming in. So, Mr. Topping, Nigel, we have a question for you, and it's about what are the incentives for individual companies to engage in increased monitoring, analysis, and reporting of their activities, of the developments they're taking in this climate agenda. We see with the SDGs that that's a challenge for companies, the monitoring and the voluntary information are provided. So in the climate sector, how is the monitoring? How are companies monitoring, and how are they giving that information?
Well, I mean, I think that just thinking quickly, I think there's three big reasons for three big incentives for that sort of transparency. The first is that by being transparent, you learn. And we're going through massive disruptions. So if you don't set yourselves the test of transparently sharing your plans, then you most likely won't learn as much. And I know this is the experience. You know, we've had thousands of companies disclosing a lot through the Carbon Disclosure Project for nearly 20 years now, and that's been one of the consistent experiences, that when companies start, it feels like a burden, but 2 or 3 years down the track, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe we didn't do this earlier, because now we know so much more. And you know, everybody's learning. Nobody's done this before. No oil and gas company has gone to net zero before. No steel company has decarbonized their entire value chain. No, so everybody's learning. So the sooner you start, the better. And being transparent is a really good way to do that. So second reason I'd say is for both current and future staff, I mean, if you want to attract talent and you're not transparent and you don't have clear goals, you're going to struggle. And the third thing, and maybe they're both related, is to do with trust. You know, we're seeing the covenant of trust between the private sector and citizenry has in many cases been broken, and the only way to bring that back is through really radical transparency.
Thank you. Okay. We have a question, Mr. Rodolfo. We have a question for you from our colleague in Bangladesh. And he wants to know that what steps can be taken at the global level to motivate all stakeholders to be keen about protecting the environment, particularly when you're coming from a context like Bangladesh, where the threat of climate change is really quite significant. So how can we motivate global leaders?
Well, we believe that it is feasible if we send the right economic signal first, but it is also feasible if we have the moral frameworks that can be translated on regulations in our countries. Sometimes, yes, we do the deployment of new technologies because it's part of our business, it's an economic reason. But in some other actions, we are taking mainly moral responsibilities with the environment, and we are taking, of course, hard decisions to help, of course, people first, to create healthy environment for people, but also to protect the wildlife. That is, for example, the main challenge during this COVID crisis. People are concerned about their jobs, the economic lockdown, if we can extrapolate the term to the economic activities. But in fact, this is caused by our bad environment management, the biodiversity loss, the land use transformation created this zoonosis that is, of course, causing pandemics. So let me finish saying that pandemics are to biodiversity loss as hurricanes to climate change, are extreme events that are related with the way we manage the planet. That's, in my opinion, the framework we have to take in consideration with moral and economic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you both. Thank you both. We're going to be moving on to our second part of our dialogue, which is going to be focusing more on enterprises themselves and their actions to promote the climate agenda. So we have Ms. Jenny Bofinger-Schuster, welcome. And she is Siemens is an IOE partner company and is deeply involved in the transformative agenda for carbon neutrality. So I'd like to ask you how is a business such as Siemens rising to the challenge and tackling the ambitious goals of climate action? Jenny,
thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me today. I'm excited to share with you insights on how we as Siemens are tackling the challenge of sustainability, and today with a focus then on decarbonization. My name is Jenny Bofinger-Schuster, and you pronounced it actually fantastically well. And I'm responsible for sustainability and corporate responsibility at Siemens. So I hope next slide, I can share with you a little bit the meaning of what sustainability and now also decarbonization means to us as a company. To start with, I'm personally getting a bit tired of all the people who would approach me and would say, oh, sustainability is something new and now it's so trendy. And then I tend to say that's actually not true. So we've been founded in 1847, and our founder, Werner von Siemens, tend to say, I won't sell the future for short-term profit. And that's actually what sustainability is about. And that's also what combating climate change is about. It's about saving the future. And we do that, and we have done that within the last, more than 170 years by innovating, by bringing our contribution as a large worldwide active company and by bringing these innovations in the fields that matter to society. And that's in health, that's in energy, that's in transport, it's in industry, and it's in buildings and in cities. That's what we are active in. And that's actually where we have the impact and where we want to contribute. So on the next slide, thank you. You can actually see where we can contribute as a large company. Well, first of all, and we like to say we eat our own dog food, right? We've actually pledged already before the Paris Agreement that we want to become CO2 neutral by 2030. And if you consider that we are active in more than 190 countries, that we have more than 300 manufacturing sites, that our fleet consists of more than 40,000 vehicles, that is bold. I mean, in these days, everyone is saying they're CO2 neutral, but we are really focusing on the real emissions and trying to get them down. So what is maybe new there? Well, what is new is we have our first big milestone approaching. So in 2020, we have promised to reduce our CO2 reductions by 50%. This milestone is approaching, and so far, it looks like we are also achieving this then by the end of this fiscal. What also is new is we have introduced in first countries an internal CO2 price. So by having these internal CO2 prices in the UK, in Brazil, for example, we actually also generate then well, first of all, we of course show a certain awareness and also learn how to deal with a potential CO2 price. But we also generate, let's say, special allocated money that we can then use again to improve the CO2 footprint in our own operations. And then another milestone, which just happened in late 2019, is that we have also anchored our own CO2 emissions in our long-term incentive scheme. So that said, our top management is now incentivized on also achieving this CO2 neutrality. That's our own operations. And that's, in our case, actually a comparably small part. So if we look into all these scopes of emissions you can have, our own operations, it's important that we get them down, and it's important that we use that also to showcase our own solutions internally to then test them and bring them afterwards to the customer, but it's rather small. We then have our supply chain, the supply chain emissions. And there we are more and more engaging with our suppliers. And we have more than 90,000 suppliers all over the world. So that's actually a huge bucket. And we are more and more engaging with them in more than 150 countries to see how we can also work on the supply chain. And then last but not least, actually the biggest responsibility and the biggest chunk that we can solve is the emissions that our solutions are having with our customers. So if we look into how much our customers can reduce their emissions by applying our technologies, you will see that in the last year, our customers were able to save more than 650 million tons of CO2 in the last year. That's around 80% of all emissions in Germany. So that's actually the big lever. The big lever is that we use our R&D, that we use our portfolio in a way that our customers can reduce their emissions. So if we go to the next slide. Well, how are we doing this? Well, it's again, and it's maybe then also coming back to Werner from Siemens and this long-term motivation in innovating into the right fields and the right energy side. So it's about having the right energy mix, bringing more and more renewables in, be it on wind, be it on hydrogen. It's about improving then the grid, having it smarter, have this grid be more intelligent in a way that it can take in all these renewables, that it can deal with that it can also be more flexible and also more resilient. And I think resilience is one of the big topics that we are now focusing on. And in order to do this, you also have to have more storage. So the grid is actually playing a crucial role in decarbonizing the world, because with the smarter grids, you can actually have much more of the renewables in and can use them, as we can now also produce them. And it's of course about more. It's about how you then also have the consumers in the grid. So I guess you're all aware of the prosumer. So now we as a consumer will also participate in the grid by, well, maybe I have some photovoltaic on my rooftop and I can bring this energy back to the grid. And that's something we are, for example, testing right now in blockchain, with blockchain in Manhattan. So that's new things that the grid will learn how to deal with. And that's very important for this overall transition. But then it's also about using the energy in an efficient manner. In buildings, it's about energy efficiency. What you can see down here is actually our new building in Munich, which is Platinum LEED certified and which is using all of these technologies to show how to run an energy efficient building. It's about decarbonizing transport. We have first e-buses. You see this on the top of the slide. We have e-buses and e-trucks that can actually go electrically. We have electric ferries and much, much more. And it's then of course also to use all this in industry. So today industry is of course using a lot of energy, and you can optimize that. You can automate certain things, you can digitalize things. Simply if you have digital twins and you don't have to test everything in real, you are saving a lot of resources.
Just giving you your 30 minutes. 30
That's perfect.
No, 30 minutes.
Because
exactly.
we can go to the last slide. So by doing all this, I really believe and push for also that we are combating climate change as Siemens. And if you ask me now, well, how is COVID changing that? Well, it doesn't. I would rather even say with COVID-19, we have learned that there is no life B and there's still no planet B. So I actually really believe that this crisis, after the worst part is over, will help us to this green recovery and to really now make this happen and to prevent us from another big crisis that is actually in front of our doors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So Nigel, we see we've got a company already aiming to reach by 2030 complete climate transformation. So we have proof of what you have been saying about the innovation capacity of the private sector. Now we're going to turn to, thank you for your presentation, Jennifer. Thank you. Now we're going to turn to Mr. Vic Van Buren, Director of the Enterprise Department at the International Labour Organization. Hello. So having extensive experience working with enterprises and the private sector at the international level and the country level, can you tell me what are your reflections on the current situation and how is ILO working in this area to help companies and enterprises move forward?
Hello, thank you very much for the opportunity. I think first of all, we need to recognize that if we focus on the work of the ILO is really in the developing economies. We learn from the developed economies, we get a lot of best practice from them, we see how they're doing it, but in the developing economies, it's going extremely tough. And to go out there now and say to them in a matter of survival mode that they're in, you need to think about green, it's a tall order. In their hearts, they want to think about green. In the reality, it's a matter of survival. And so we've got to find a way of helping them from the survival to reactivation to recovery mode through the economic crisis that they're experiencing through COVID, and also then build into that recovery the concept of green. And I think the selling point has got to be that in the medium to longer term, the green recovery is going to make business sense. No matter where you are, if you build in green recovery, it's going to make sense to what you're doing and how you're going to do it. And so start factoring that in now, as difficult as it may be. And so from the ILO, we're taking it from a strategic point, first of all, and looking at policy advice and advocacy, but then trying to find best case examples across the globe that we can share with constituencies to show them how it can be done. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to go into detail on the slide, but these are the 4 response areas of the ILO. But if you look at pillar number 2 in the top right-hand corner, you'll see that supporting enterprises, jobs and income is paramount to the work of the ILO, together with stimulating economy, looking at the workers' role, and looking at the process like social dialogue. Next slide, please. If you look at the next slide, the COVID-19 pandemic is presenting an opportunity, because you can see some of the clean air that is being reported, some of the benefits for an environmental area, not necessarily in other areas from health and from an economic perspective, but there are some positive spin-offs that we need to capture and see if we can't build that into the green recovery. The reopening of economies will bring an opportunity to foster transition to a green economy. Once again, we believe that's possible. And in the earlier presentations, we heard about the jobs that can be created. 24 million jobs can be created. This can only be done through enterprises, and particularly the small and medium enterprises. So we need to focus our assistance on them. A sustained 5% annual increase in recycling rates for plastics, glass, etc., will be a primary, for the direct extraction of primary resources for these products can generate another 6 million jobs. So planning for the future, we need to look at innovative ways. And what we hear from some of the examples of the companies on this panel are some of the innovative and creative ideas. And it's how we capture that within the ILO and the other institutions like the OECD and convey this to those in the developing economy so they can use that to follow the hard and difficult path that lays ahead. In the next slide, please. I'm going to try and touch on some of the practical examples. We need to be practical, capturing the quick wins on urgent employment creation through sustainable enterprises. Many developing countries are faced with an urgent need to address the employment crisis. And so they need to be encouraged to focus on, as I said, the green recovery in this phase. They can target support to innovation, entrepreneurship and decent work in ITC-based solutions, telemedicine, urban farming, sustainable mobility. These are just some practical examples. In many developing and emerging economies, several prototypes of touchless hand washing systems were produced by using recycled or reused materials. We're going to have to move people and get them to understand there's a new market niche that can be identified. The healthcare is very dominant and prominent in the minds of everyone at the moment, and has got to be an area that perhaps some battling SMEs can redirect. And in doing so, redirecting their activities, can also find themselves dealing with the green recovery agenda. In Ghana, you'll see a startup is using drones to deliver medicines, blood and medical materials to health centers. In South Africa, we have the Shona-equipped social enterprise that manufactures multiple use respirators. So these are people that are capturing the gap in the market and making putting into their business plan a redirection and canvassing and using their business for local markets as well. If we can go into the next slide, please. At the macro level, I think the ILO is looking at a COVID enterprise resource intervention response to support enterprises. We've got briefs that we put out, and we've got very clear guidelines through a just transition guideline and COVID briefs that can provide a step-by-step path for companies and enterprises to follow. Restructuring for recovery and resilience in response to COVID-19 crisis is what the one paper is entitled. We've got the Partnership for Action in the Green Economy, which is a global program for countries and for social partners to come on board. And so we've got 30 countries already. I don't have time to go into the detail, but at the ILO, we can provide the detail to those who wish to delve down deeper into some of these global and national programs that are providing support. We also have within the ILO a tool called SCORE, which is sustaining competitive and responsible enterprises. And so I can start listing a number of tools that can provide help to the enterprises at the grassroots level. But at the global level, we also are embarked. You can go to the next slide, please. I'm not sure. Okay, sorry, that is the last slide. But there's one area I want to mention, that the Secretary General of the UN recently launched, just before COVID, a Climate Action for Jobs initiative. And we're going to be working closely with the employers on this, because they are such a key component, as well as the workers, in determining the path that we should follow. We need to learn from enterprises to support enterprises. It cannot be a supply-driven initiative, but rather demand from the grassroots that gets us to put into action a technical support mechanism that can help them. I sound like a preacher, but this is the work of the ILO at the moment, and this is what we want to focus on. So it's from a policy level to grassroots practical solutions we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. You're all very efficient speakers. You're all so Nigel and Rodolfo, we're getting more questions in the chat box. So I hope you stick around with us so that we can follow up on those questions after our next speaker. And speaking of our next speaker, it's really a big honor for IOE to introduce Ms. Nancy Ibarra. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Palacio. She's Director of Sustainable Production and Consumption at Andy, and she is actually going to give us an overview of how their work in Colombia and how they're helping companies achieve their climate objectives and the support they're offering. So Nancy, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. We are very happy to share with you this important panel. Our president couldn't do it today, but we are very honored to share this experience. So please go to the next slide. So since I don't know everyone know about Andy, we are the most important business association in Colombia. We have more than 1,500 companies. We represent 50% of GDP, and we have regional branches, at least in 12 regions, as well as representing 31 sectors. So we have to cope with different sector priorities. And these give us some special way to think how to take action on climate change and sustainability. So the first thing that we take into account when designing this action is first inspiring by the global development and global trends. This is the first step. The second step, since we are a focal point with the government, just at national, local level, we need to think how policy and physical boundaries and conditions could work in our particular environment. And then we need to think about regional and local and try to think how bottom and top down could talk. And in that way, we can find which are the priorities of us as an employer organization. The second area is how we add value to our associates, and business alone could do a lot of things, but we can do that in a better way in a collective action through business leadership. So the big add value of our organizations to create collective action. And then please continue. Some people were talking about transparency and performances. You cannot make collective action if you don't use first science-based targets, because environment and sustainability are based on this data, on this study, on these figures. You can make KPIs and metrics, because in other ways it's impossible to measure the performance of our companies on our collective action. And in that way, when you have science-based targets, metrics, and you can measure performance, you can make engagements, long-term engagements, short-term engagements, and agreements with the society, which lead me to the next. Yes, because society is all business, employees, our suppliers, our clients, our different stakeholders at regional level. So we really need to think about society when dealing with taking action on climate change and sustainability. And that's the way we cope with that at our organization. So I give you some examples, because normally speech is easy, but I want to give you what we really do. So we have a very important experience in circular economy. We are dealing with a 10-year project. Right now, we start with 100 companies last year. This year we have almost 200 companies working with $2 million raising in order to work on recycling, packaging, create green solutions to recycling and other technologies. We are working on social inclusion. We are dealing with regional collection infrastructure developments in order to close the loop of the packaging materials. We have a national regulation, but you have very big companies, small and medium companies working on the same target. And we were selected by the IDB as a model for the Pacific Alliance on how to cope with corporate partnerships on packaging and circular economy. So please continue. We have 22 sectors, and if you look, these are the brands behind our project, and we are growing very, very fast. trying to make collective action circular economy. And circular economy also tackles climate change. You can continue, please. It's just 1 month ago, 2 weeks ago, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation just put up a document and say circular economy tackles climate change. If you look at the design phase, if you look at the use phase, if you look at the sustainable lifestyles, or how we work, how we deal with our daily behavior, we can make a great change on CO2. They say that almost 45% of CO2 emission could be reduced on circular economy projects. Next example of this, we are working on collective action on business and biodiversity. We are working with almost 20 companies from the oil, gas, energy, mining, and building sector. It's an initiative which has been awarded by IUCN, because we are working with leadership of business to avoid loss of biodiversity. We work in 3 regions, 3 hotspot areas like Amazon, Andean, urban areas where we can work on biodiversity. It's possible to make offsets when you work on urban biodiversity. And also we work on the Caribbean, talking about adaptation and working on water regulation, working on forest, and working on alternative energy sources in areas where wind as well as solar radiation are potential to improve our energy sources in Colombia. Continue. So this is also a way to work on, please, to work on climate change. Continue, please. Because we are working on ecosystem resiliences, we are working on generation, we are working on sustainable livelihood, diversified incomes from community, we are working on food security, and we are working on nature-based business. And everything is from a collective action and helping with different cooperation agencies as well as the leadership of the companies. Let's continue. And now we are dealing with a pilot project on green transport in Bogota. We are working to improve sustainable urban freight transport with all our sectors in our capital. And this is a project that we already do 4 years ago. Now it's the moment to improve. It was at the national level, right now it's at a city level. And we are working to reduce GHG emission and improve air quality and work on CO2 offset alternatives at urban level in order to work in these 3 sites of green transport. It was selected by P4G partnerships globally, and it could be a replicable initiative on GHG mitigation. So as you look, all these projects work on global, work on local and regional, are driven by business sector. We have metrics, we work on SDGs indicators, and we look every year about the different impacts that we have and outcomes from our collective action. And this is very important from this type of initiatives. So now—
Just to interrupt you and give you your 30-second warning.
Perfect, I'm gonna end just right now. Please continue. So with this pandemic situation, what do we have to do now? We have to understand that global health equals to greener, healthier, and more sustainable business. Continue. Global health also equals to greener, healthier, more and sustainable ecosystems. Please continue. And finally, we need a greener, healthier, and more sustainable society. Each of one has a role, and we can do this together. But we need to understand that short-term risk that we are dealing right now could turn into challenging opportunities in the long-term run. And if we just understand both ideas, I believe that we are gonna take in the good decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you all. Now I have a lot of questions that have come in, so I hope you're all available still. Jenny, we have a question for you. And this question is about how blockchain, blockchain aspect of your strategy. So could you actually elaborate, clarify how this technology is, and how you're integrating into your sustainability program and beyond? Thank you.
Okay, I mean, blockchain is a big topic, and the example that I was sharing was New York, where we are using it to have this prosumer, so how you as actually a consumer can participate in the grid, how to make this easier. So basically what we are testing there is that neighbors have photovoltaic on their rooftops, and that they can trade this energy with each other. And the way this transaction is being conducted is based on blockchain. So by doing so, you can obviously have that, or ideally we hope and believe this is going to be then easier and paperless and all that. And so by doing so, if you're at home, you're baking a cake, you need electricity while your neighbor is at work and is not using the electricity that he or she is producing on her rooftop. So then actually you can automatically trade the energy with your neighbor. And it's the first time I'm presenting this case actually after COVID. So now that the home is gaining in importance, as I would say, this case probably even gains more importance than in the future.
Thank you. So
I hope that
the blockchain is really pervasive, is a really pervasive, an integral part of your strategy.
I think it's one, I'm not a blockchain expert, but blockchain is obviously one of the new technology that is one puzzle piece that you would add to make sure that your transactions are being easier and more flexible.
Right, Victor, we have a question for you, actually. I've got something about skills. I just want to bring that one up. And what are the ILO's plans to, either through SCORE or PAGE, to promote green skills for sustainability of policymakers and practitioners? If so, what do you see are the secret ingredients for promoting these skills?
Last year, the ILO, through the skills branch, and together with the Green Jobs Department or unit, produced a global report on skills for a greener future. And we covered 32 countries, including 10 PAGE countries. And that report and studies are the basis for our support at the policy and programmatic level. And this is certainly something that we use now in all of our PAGE rollout in the actions in the countries, but not only in PAGE countries, in other countries as well. So this is something that we have already examined and looked at the success stories. What are the key areas in the policy and in the operational side of things with regards to skills? I think skills is important in every facet of enterprises' activity, and skills enhancement, lifelong learning, and so we can mention some of the key principles. But in the rollout, social dialogue plays an extremely important part. And social dialogue is imperative in the design and implementation and evaluation of skills development, both at the national and at the sectoral level. And I think that's where you have to look at process being equally important as content. But what we need to recognize is that many countries are lagging with their skills policies. It's not business as usual, and the skills that you had some years ago and the skills that you're churning out might not be the relevant skills for future markets. And so governments at policy level have to have a rethink and align themselves with the needs of what the private sector is looking for, so you can match the skills with the skills gap. And that includes on the greening, green recovery. Here we've got to find out what it is required of a line manager or a worker in order to build in their activities in enhancing productivity, in fulfilling their job requirements, but also looking at the environmental component. Thank you.
Thank you. Rodolfo, we have a question for you that we want to bring you back into the conversation here. And we're asked, we want to know about, the long-term mindship of COVID and the OEC's Environment Directorate. How are you collaborating with other units within the organization to ensure coherence across the policy spectrum within the organization? I don't know if you hear me.
Hello.
Hello. Hello. Welcome back.
Okay. Yes. Regarding the coordination between different disciplines, because when we about different directorates, we are talking about people that are dealing with taxes, people that is dealing with finance, the others are with the national accounts, we with environmental topics. So the main purpose of our activity is to harmonize, of course, the policy advice for our countries, but in my duty is to put environment at the front. That is quite difficult because, you know, the economists are always thinking in rational decisions. Sometimes you cannot take rational decisions, for example, when you have a disease. So what kind of decisions you have to take? Well, decisions that are related, as I was explaining, with the life itself. So that's why this is something that I explain always to my team. That's why in all countries, health laws are up to all sectorial laws. And environment regulation is linked to health laws. So that means that if we are seeing, for example, air quality contingency, we coordinate our efforts with the health ministry to put, to stop the traffic, for example, or to stop some specific activities. This is happening also during the COVID crisis. Because of the health emergency, many sectors are aligned to the main objective, that is protect the human life. But in the environment, we are always arguing that, okay, let's put money in the national account. How much is the natural capital we have? How much we are losing? How much human lives? What is the cost of a human life? You know that in the epidemiological models, the human life has a value, and it depends on the insurance companies. And the value of a human life in Africa is different than in Europe, than in the United States, than in Mexico. So sometimes you do meta-analysis of epidemiological studies, papers, and in fact, you have to look for the details, because sometimes you are comparing apples with melons or avocados. No? So it's different. So we have now this new paradigm that is based in the Sustainable Development Goals, that is the circular economy paradigm. And what we are trying to create is this new mimification of the planet in the economy. That means that instead of thinking in single-use products or linear production lanes and markets or supply chains, we have to think in the circularity as the planet is working every day. So because of this linearity in the human activity, we broke all the cycles, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycles, and now we are breaking the biological cycles. So that's the main objective of doing this. So my main argument is this is because of health reasons.
Yes.
And
I want to ask you a question that we asked Nigel, and I want to come back to Nancy with this question as well, because she referred to KPIs. But this whole notion of monitoring, how are you monitoring? And Jenny gave us also how she's doing it. They're doing it in Siemens, but how are you monitoring your members? Are they providing you with information in terms of their climate goals that they have elaborated? Are you monitoring, and how are you monitoring?
Sorry, is that question for me?
No, I'm going to asking Rodolfo for the OECD.
Okay.
Rodolfo, this is question for you about how you are monitoring your members.
We have a environment at a glance platform. That means that we have a information system. So we are handling more or less 1,400 different indicators of our OECD country members and partners. And you can consult this database. It's a database of databases. We call it a data cube from different topics, different layers, different countries, a historical record of all OECD members. And this is like Wikipedia, no? We are progressively improving the information system we have at the OECD. So the statistics, because this is an intergovernmental organization, the link we have with governments is through the national accounts and through the environment ministries that are keeping environment data at their countries. So I asked, of course, them how air quality is, what is the situation of the air quality in this city or globally in country, in this specific country.
Okay.
And we created statistics and we updated the statistics every day.
Okay.
That's the way we do it.
Okay, so you have 1,400 indicators. Nancy, I want to go back to you because you mentioned KPIs and that you had KPIs linked to your programs. Can you just tell us some of those KPIs and how you're measuring the success of reaching those KPIs?
Well, it depends on the project. For instance, on packaging, we are working right now on the baseline of 48 categories of materials, of packaging materials that we put on the market. And we are going to have this baseline at the end of the year. In that way, you can make decisions on how to do with these materials that have more impact than others, and try to think about what is the capacity of the country to respond to these recycling targets. We are dealing with collection rates. We are dealing with recycling rates of different collection alternatives that we have right now. We are working on how to invest in new technologies, energy recovering from waste, as well as recycling new solutions, because plastic is the main challenge for everyone. And we are dealing with that, and that's why IDB is financing our project. We are working also on how many organizations of waste pickers, which are informal, and now we want to make the formal enterprises on waste. So we are dealing with the number of organizations that are working with us and improving their KPIs as well as enterprises, and make social development with this kind of organization. And we are also working on best practice on design, because we have 22 sectors, 22 examples, ambassadors of eco-design. So this is, for instance, one example on biodiversity. We are working on special species, because if you look at one species on a particular ecosystem, you can look at the healthy ecosystem in that part. So it's necessary to look also at quality of resources, of the community involved, the investment on the new business, small business that we are running on with them. If you look at green transport, of course, we use GHG protocol. We measure not only GHG emission, but also air quality emissions. And we are working with IT technology to put on the trucks a special device just to move and really look at the emission at the moment that you are driving. And in that way, you can improve also the different actions that we have in transport. So there are some
Thank you. Yeah, that's very, very, very specific and very granular, very helpful.
Okay.
Time for one last question. It's for you, Vic. It's about the survival being green. Do you have any specific examples of actions in developing countries, especially Africa, linked to that initiative?
Yes, in my presentation I mentioned two, but I'll add a third one. And just to recap on that, the social enterprises manufacturing multiple use full face respirators for frontline workers, healthcare workers, and anyone else at risk and that's in South Africa. And it shows how an enterprise has come into the market at very short notice and being able to do something to develop their industry, their particular enterprise. The next one I'm going to mention is RIMA Medical Technologies platform based in Benin. Allowed more than 5,000 African medical doctors from more than 20 countries to exchange information and data in real time and to develop community of practice. So that's a second example. And the third one is the one I mentioned in Ghana, where there's a startup using drones to deliver medicine to the rural areas, blood and medical materials. And so they've come into a gap as well. So these are three very good examples of what can, and there are many more that if one starts exploring, we put out 24 briefs of best practice scenarios. I've just picked out 3 and make that available. So yes, there's many examples, and these are 3 that I'd like to mention now.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I just want to conclude, before we go to Roberto's concluding thoughts, I want to read a comment that's talking about how environmental degradation, economic inequality, food insecurity, and that we can't address these problems in isolation. When one of them worsens, it has an effect on the entire system. And I think that that's a very helpful comment. Thank you, a very valid comment. So Roberto, if you're still, you're there, I wanted to call you back in to give some concluding reflections and thoughts.
Well, thank you again. I mean, more than concluding reflection and thoughts, if you allow me, I would identify follow-up action from our side, because at the end of the day, that's what we want. The first one, and based also on the rich contribution from all, and I want to really thank you to all the participants, and also for those who also raised questions. I think that make the debate much more valuable. But first of all, our engagement of IOE, and I think that's important. What's the best contribution that we can make right now? I am convinced that the best contribution is to better engage, better activate our network. That means also to leverage the capacity of our employers' organization around the world to engage and commit with the climate change debate. And that's not easy, because sometimes there are capacity issues, sometimes there are awareness issues, but we are committed as IOA, and we are going to push this agenda. And we start now also precisely with a follow-up outcome out of this discussion, which will be sent out to our members. And beyond spreading it, what we want is also to work within the specific items. Because by now, employers' organizations and business organizations have been involved, perhaps at national level, not so much with us at global level, and that's the point. I think one of the intervenants also referred to the mix of policy and actors doing together. Well, you have to bring the champions. I mean, the companies, the global companies that are already doing a lot. But at the end of the day, you don't change the settings. If you don't change the regulations, you will not make a difference. And we referred that the best way to do it is with partnerships, with efficient partnerships. But perhaps another area of follow-up is how we can bring efficient partnerships through identifying, and I'm taking the example of Vic, business case, which matter, especially for developing economies. And we have to bear in consideration that 60% of the occupied population right now is in the formal sector. It's not in the formal sector. So at the same time that we think about being green as a survival tool, we have to think how being green is not just a survival tool, it's a way also to promote transitions towards formality. So if we manage to identify that, I think that we'll be able to have the basis for good partnerships, efficient partnerships. Finally, and a third point is, at the end of the day, we are very also good on employment, on skills as IOE, but also on social dialogue. And we shouldn't underestimate the fact that working also together with ILO, we can also make a difference in terms of attitudes at the workplace and in terms of skills, anticipating skills. So we are going also to push this agenda as strongly as we can, but also in cooperation with all of you. And it's great to have here Rodolfo from OECD, but also our colleague from UNFCCC, our partner companies in this case. Thank you very much. Siemens, Jenny, for joining us here. But also the employees organizations, and Andy, the employee organization in Colombia, is a big example of how you can push the agenda in a developing economy. So again, thank you to all of you, and we are looking forward to continue this path of engagement at this critical period. Thank you so much, Jean, and great job also optimizing the time.
Yes, I think I was a little too efficient with the time. Any parting thoughts from our panelists as we have 5 minutes? Any reflections going forward? Yeah. I have one final thing. I think in terms of, Jenny, in terms of Siemens and your ambitions for the 2030, which I actually find really very exciting. In your dealings with your suppliers, how are you dealing with those suppliers and in communicating and changing their mindsets about the climate initiatives? How are you changing suppliers' mindsets?
So this is a dialogue. Thank you for the question. This is a dialogue that has been initiated, and it depends really on the supplier as such. And I wouldn't want to reveal so much at this time, but maybe a bit later than in this year. Because this is starting, and I mean, obviously, you have to see many of these suppliers are also struggling with the decarbonization efforts on their side. So I think also for the suppliers, it counts true that it's important to share with them sort of what we've done in our sort of our own dog food story again, right? So sort of what we have done in our company, and also, you know, also maybe share the not so positive, sort of the experiences, the struggle. It's not everything is that easy, right? And to then rather have an open dialogue and see how can we improve certain things, and how can we get there.
Thank you, because I think it's about, yeah, changing mindsets. And I think that's the broader
Right.
with the climate. It's about how we change mindsets with our suppliers, with our clients, customers, with all of the stakeholders around us. So indeed, I've had a very efficient time. Thank you all for adhering to your schedule time, and looking forward to continuing this conversation and in continuing this engagement. And we'll speak soon. Any final thoughts? No? I just want to wish you all a really wonderful day, and look forward to our next dialogue.
Bye-bye.